Okay, so Rawls' a social contract argument. So after explaining why he rejects utilitarianism, he starts to present his own position. And this argument has two parts. The first part that we're going to look at in this episode, the social contract argument, is by far the most important, though I actually think it's the least impressive part. But anyway, this is where we begin. So this is another thought experiment. So you're to imagine that you are in the state of nature. Like Hobbes, we've seen this before. We've seen this with Hobbes, we've seen this with Locke. There's a very long tradition of this kind of thinking in political philosophy. It's also Rousseau and Kant and others. You imagine that you're in the state of nature. So you imagine that there's no law, no political institutions, no rules, no nothing. And your job, along with other people, the other people in your society, is to determine the rules by which your society will be governed. Okay. And this idea that we're in the state of nature and that we have to go to a kind of convention in which we'd set out all the rules, the basic rules by which our society is going to be governed, is called by Rawls the original position. So we've got to imagine that we're in the original position. We do this thought experiment. We imagine that we're in the state of nature and we go to this convention where we set out the basic rules of our society and then we agree to them. And that's the social contract. Now, before we look at this in any detail, I want to deal with a problem with that arguments of this kind have. Right, so a general problem with social contract arguments. And the general problem arises from the fact that this social contracting never happened. So there was no state of nature in which we all got together into a constitutional convention, and this never happened, right? This is just an imaginary thought experiment. Okay, now why is that important? Well, because the social contract argument is supposed to somehow generate obligations. And the problem is, it seems that, it's supposed to generate obligations in the sense that it shows me that I'm supposed to do something. So what Rawls is going to do is he's going to say, look, in the original position, in the state of nature at this convention, you would agree to such and such and such and such. And so therefore, Ellen, you're actually bound by those principles. Okay, that's the basic nature of the argument that he's going to present. And we saw something similar from Locke and something similar from Hobbes. If you were in the state of nature, then you would agree to such and such. Okay, you have those obligations. But the problem, as I say, is that this never happened, right? I was never in the state of nature and I never did agree to any such obligations. And the issue here is that generally, as we lawyers know, and especially, you can't generate obligations from what somebody would have agreed to. I know, of course, we know this in law, that in order for there to be a contract, there has to be an actual offer and an acceptance. You can't go to court and say, look, this person is bound because she would have agreed she would have accepted had I made an offer, right? That argument doesn't work. You have to show that you did make an offer and the other person accepted, or the other way around. You can't show that if I had have made an offer, then the other person would have accepted, and so therefore there is a binding contract. Right? That doesn't work. There's all the difference in the world between saying you did agree and saying you would have agreed. Right? And the problem with the social contract argument is it looks as if it's failing to accept this. It's failing to understand this. It tries to generate obligations of the you agreed kind by showing that you would have agreed. And that just looks like a fallacy. It looks like a fallacious way of reasoning. Right? The social contract is supposed to be a contract. Right? It's not a contract that would have happened had something else occurred. Right? The idea is you're bound to obey these rules because the social contract contains those rules. Yeah, but the social contract never happened. There was never any contract, and I'm not, therefore, bound by those rules. That's how the argument goes. Okay, so what are we to say about this? Well, the first thing is that we just have to accept that you can't generate obligations that are supposed to be based on consent, except from actual consent. You can't say, well, you would have consented, so therefore you are obligated because of your consent. Because I never consented. The social contract never happened. So we have to think about the social contract differently. If the arguments are going to succeed, we have to think about them differently. Well, how can we think about them? How could we think about the social contract argument that makes it meaningful? Now, I think this kind of case is helpful. It helps to show what the social contract arguments can do. Okay, so imagine that I wake up one morning and one of my kids is there pulling at my duvet, going, come on, Dad, take us to the beach. And let's say that I don't want to take them to the beach because imagine I've had a few too many beers the night before and I stayed up really late and I'm tired and I've got a bit of a headache and whatever. I don't want to go. And I say to the kids, no, I'm not taking you. I'm going to sleep and I'm not taking you. And they say to me, oh, Dad, if you hadn't drunk too much last night, then you would have taken us. Right? Now, on the face of it, I could respond to that by saying, yeah, but I did drink too much last night, so I'm not going to take you, so bugger off. Right? But what are they actually getting at? When my kids say this to me, they say, oh, if you hadn't stayed up too late, you hadn't drunk too much, you would have taken us. What do they say? They're not saying, oh, but Dad, you are obliged to take us because you would have consented to an agreement had we asked you yesterday. That's not what they're saying. What they're doing in a case like this is reminding me of what I actually think I ought to do. And it can be a very powerful tool. What they're doing there is they're reminding me of what I already believe that I ought to do, but I'm kind of hiding that knowledge from myself because I've got a headache and I'm tired and I'd rather just sleep in. Thanks very much. Right, they're revealing to me my own beliefs. Right, they're revealing to me that actually deep down, if I actually stopped and thought about it, if I just forgot for a minute about my headache and stopped being selfish for a minute and actually thought deeply about what I really believe I ought to do, I believe I should take them to the beach. That's what's going on. And that's what's going on with the social contract argument. Rawls is not saying that because you would have agreed to such and such in the state of nature, you are bound by contract. He's not saying that. He's saying this is a thought experiment that we can use to reveal to you what your commitments to justice already are. Okay, that's the idea. I can reveal to you what your commitments to justice already are by putting you into this imaginary situation in which you'll see, it'll become clear to you what you are already committed to, what you already believe. And a lot of philosophy is like this. It might sound strange, but a lot of it is about making clear to us what it is that we already believe about things. Because the truth is, that might sound, why does it sound odd? It might sound odd to you because, I already know what I believe about things, right? I already know what I believe about things. Surely philosophy's job is to tell me what I should believe. Right? But in fact, I don't think it's necessarily true that you know what you believe. I think it's often the case that we're not clear about what we believe. We're often very confused about what it is that we believe. And we often believe a whole lot of contradictory things at once. And part of the job of philosophy is to sort out what's going on inside our own heads, right? And the social contract argument can play a role here. It can make clear to us what it is that we're already committed to, even though we don't understand that we have that commitment. Okay, so Rawls asks us to imagine that we're in the state of nature, right? We're going to go to a convention where we're going to, in combination with the other people that will be in our society, to determine the principles of justice that will govern that society. And Rawls calls that the original position. Right. Now, he also recognizes that people are inclined to pick principles that will favor their personal circumstances. So let's just say, for example, that I'm very talented at, this is a stupid example, but you'll see that it'll help to see the point. Let's say that I'm extremely talented at painting, right? I might want to choose principles of justice that favor artistic expression or something, so that artists will do very well under these principles. Or let's say that I think I'm really good, and this may be a bit less stupid. I think I'm a really good entrepreneur, I'm really good at making money, then I might favour principles that will favour people that make money, and I might not care very much about people who don't have that talent. Okay, so people will naturally choose principles that, or there at least there's a tendency for people to choose principles of justice in the original position that will favour their talents. But so Rawls says we need to introduce one extra idea, and that is the idea that he calls the veil of ignorance. Okay, so I have to imagine that I am in the original position behind a veil of ignorance. What's the veil of ignorance? I have to imagine that I'm deciding principles for the society in which I live, principles of justice for the society in which I will live, where I don't know what place I will hold in that society. So I don't know in that society whether I'll be rich or poor, the society that we're creating principles of justice for. I don't know whether I'll be rich or poor. I don't know whether I'll be an artist, have artistic talent or not, or none. I don't know whether I'll be good at sport or not. I don't know whether I'll have lots of friends or not. I don't know whether I'll be male or female. I don't know whether I'll be white or black. I don't know any of these things. Okay, I'm to decide from behind a veil of ignorance. So I make my decisions, but I don't know what position I will occupy in the society that we are creating. Okay, and this means that I'm unable to produce principles of justice that favors my position, because I don't know what my position will be. Right, that's a very important idea, the idea of the veil of ignorance. And of course, the point of the veil of ignorance is to force me to choose principles of justice fairly. Right, I can't choose principles of justice that favor me because I don't know what position I will be in that society. The point of the veil of ignorance is to force me to choose fairly. Now, on this basis, Rawls argues that we'll pick two principles of justice, although I say two, there's kind of three, but we'll deal with that in the next episode. One thing I want to talk about now is the nature of, or something very important about the nature of the kind of inquiry that Rawls is conducting here. It is, to use another slogan that Rawls invents, political, not metaphysical. Political, not metaphysical. What does that mean? Okay, and this is very important. What does it mean? Very important. In the Constitutional Convention, in this convention that we're at, where we're trying to determine what principles of justice will govern the society in which we live, we are trying to get consensus on general principles of justice, right? And that's it. We're not trying to get any more consensus than that. We're trying to get consensus on the principles of justice that will govern society, and that's all. We're not trying to get any more consensus than that. We are not trying to get consensus on, for example, whether there's a God. We're not trying to get consensus on what God commands, what kind of life God would want us to live if there is a God. We're not trying to get consensus on what morality requires any more than we need for the principles of justice. We're not trying to get consensus on what kind of life people should live. We're not trying to get consensus on what's valuable in life. We're not trying to get consensus on what's important, on what's significant, on whether people are better than others or people are equal. Or we're not trying to get consensus on any of these things except consensus on principles of justice. So in other words, what Rawls is saying here, this is hence the slogan, we're trying to get a political consensus, a consensus on the basic political structure of our society, on the basic political or the basic principles of political justice, but we're not trying to get consensus on the metaphysical stuff, on whether there's a God, on whether human beings have souls, on whether what the way human beings ought to live. All that stuff we can just leave out. Okay, and this is important because it means that Rawls's position allows for enduring pluralism. See, as long as we can get a consensus on the basic principles of justice, we can disagree on whether God exists. We can disagree on which the right God is. We can disagree on what morality requires. We can disagree on what's important in life. We can disagree on all of that and continue to disagree on all of that. We can be pluralistic. We can tolerate people having different views than we do. Right? We can be pluralistic. Now compare this to Bentham. To accept Bentham's theory, you have to accept the lot, right? There's a huge package here, to use the jargon again, a metaphysical package that you have to accept. You have to accept that pleasure is the only thing that's valuable. You have to accept that human beings are motivated only by pleasure. Right? You have to accept these things, and if you don't accept them, then his theory doesn't get off the ground. But with Rawls, it's different. Right? You don't have to accept what's important. You don't have to accept what's intrinsically valuable. Well, we can disagree about these things. We can continue to debate them in the future. We just have to accept principles of justice. We just have to come to a political consensus. Okay, so it's also important to say that we need to agree on the basic principles without necessarily agreeing on why we're agreeing. Okay, so here we are in the Constitutional Convention. Our job is to come up with basic principles of justice. We have to agree on those principles, but I might have one set of reasons for agreeing with those principles, and you might have a completely different set of reasons for agreeing with those principles. That doesn't matter. As long as we agree with the principles, that's okay. We need to have an overlapping consensus, but we don't need to have an overlapping consensus on the reasons for the consensus. And what we see here, and this is also very important, is a separation between public and private realms. The public realm requires a consensus, the private realm doesn't. So we have to agree on the principles of justice, that's public, but we don't have to agree on our reasons for agreeing to the principles of justice, that's private. So we have a separation between the private and the public sphere here. And Rawls's position is that the success of a political society requires consensus in the political realm, but not in the private realm. In the private realm, we can be left alone. In the public realm, we are required to adhere to the norms of our society. But in the private realm, we can be left alone. An idea that's supposed to guarantee our liberty in a way that we'll see in the next episode is very important for Rawls.